I should have known something was different about Alexander from the moment we started talking after that Sunday morning hike. Most guys in the hiking group were either showing off or trying too hard to be funny, but he had this quiet intensity that made me curious. When we finally exchanged numbers after 2 months of group conversations, he opened up about his ex-girlfriend Kay in a way that caught me completely off guard. She made some accusations that weren't true. He said, his voice getting tight, false accusations that led to charges. It nearly destroyed my life before everything got sorted out. He looked at me with this vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I moved here to start fresh, but it's hard to trust again after something like that. I reached over and touched his hand, feeling this surge of protectiveness mixed with something that felt like opportunity. Here was this good man who'd been hurt by someone careless and cruel, someone who clearly didn't appreciate what she had. I would never do something like that to you. I promised him, and I meant it completely. I wasn't like Kay. I could see that he was special, that he deserved someone who would value him properly. Someone like me. The difference between us was obvious from the start. Where Kay had been reckless and destructive, I was thoughtful and caring. Where she had thrown away something precious, I would treasure it. Alexander needed someone who understood his worth, and I was exactly that person. When he looked at me with those grateful eyes, I felt this warm satisfaction knowing I was giving him something he'd never had before. Real love from someone who actually deserved him. Our relationship moved forward with this beautiful momentum that felt completely natural. Alexander was attentive in ways I'd never experienced, remembering little things I mentioned and planning thoughtful dates that showed how much he was paying attention. When he proposed exactly 1 year after we started dating, choosing the same hiking trail where we'd first really talked, I felt this deep sense of rightness about everything. This was how love was supposed to work, two people who appreciated each other, building something meaningful together. I can't imagine my life without you, he said as he got down on one knee. And looking at his hopeful face, I knew he meant every word. Will you marry me? Rachel. Yes, I said, and the happiness in his expression made me feel powerful and cherished at the same time. This was what I'd been waiting for my whole life. Someone who recognized my value and was willing to commit completely to building a future with me. Alexander wasn't like the other men I'd dated who took me for granted or expected me to settle for less than I deserved. He saw me clearly and chose me anyway, which proved that I'd been right to wait for someone worthy of what I had to offer. The first 2 years of marriage unfolded exactly like I'd hoped they would. We settled into our shared life with an ease that felt natural and right, creating routines and traditions that belonged just to us. Alexander was consistently thoughtful, always checking in about my day and making sure I felt heard and valued. When we had disagreements about normal married couple, things like finances or whose family to visit for holidays, he approached everything with this determination to communicate and find solutions that worked for both of us. But somewhere in the middle of our 3rd year together, I started noticing things that hadn't bothered me before. Alexander's predictability, which had once felt comforting, began to feel suffocating. He had the same routine every morning, the same way of loading the dishwasher, the same topics of conversation over dinner. When I tried to bring up my restlessness, he would launch into these earnest discussions about marriage requiring work and compromise, completely missing the point that I wasn't looking for a lecture about commitment. I feel like we're stuck in a rut. I told him one evening after another identical dinner conversation about his work project and my day at the office. All couples go through phases like this. He replied with that patient tone that was starting to grate on me. What matters is that we keep communicating and making effort for each other. But that was exactly the problem. Everything felt like effort now. The spontaneity and excitement that had drawn me to him was buried under layers of routine and responsibility. I found myself getting irritated by small things that shouldn't have mattered. Like the way he always wanted to plan our weekends in advance, or how he never seemed to understand when I just wanted to be left alone. When I tried to explain that I needed more space and less constant discussion about our relationship, he would nod seriously and then want to talk about that too. The worst part was how he seemed completely content with our life exactly as it was. While I was feeling increasingly restless and unfulfilled, Alexander appeared genuinely happy with our predictable routine and endless conversations about feelings and future plans. It made me wonder if we were really as compatible as I'd thought, or if I'd been so grateful to find someone stable after watching him get hurt by Kay that I'd overlooked fundamental differences between us. I started taking my phone with me everywhere, not because I was hiding anything specific, but because I needed some space that felt entirely my own. When Alexander noticed and made gentle comments about it, I felt this flash of irritation that he was monitoring my behavior like some kind of security guard. I'm not Kay. I reminded him, you don't need to watch me like I'm going to betray you. The hurt look on his face made me feel guilty, but also resentful that I had to manage his insecurities on top of everything else. I'd promised I would never hurt him the way Kay had, and I'd kept that promise completely. But apparently that wasn't enough. he also expected me to never need any privacy or independence, which felt suffocating and unfair. Everything changed the day Marcus came to deliver propane to our house. Alexander was at work, and I was home dealing with yet another household maintenance issue that felt like a symbol of how mundane our life had become. When Marcus knocked on the door, I expected the usual quick transaction with some middle-aged delivery guy who'd be in and out in 5 minutes. Instead, I opened the door to find someone completely different from what I was expecting. Marcus was probably close to my age, with this easy confidence and a smile that made me suddenly aware of how long it had been since a man had looked at me like I was interesting, rather than just familiar. He took longer than necessary to explain the propane hookup, asking questions about our setup that seemed designed to keep our conversation going. "Your husband's lucky to have someone who handles all this household stuff," he said as he finished up. And something about the way he said it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in months. "He works a lot," I heard myself saying. "I pretty much manage everything here on my own." Marcus nodded with this understanding look that felt like he actually got what I was dealing with. "That's a lot of responsibility for one person. Most guys don't realize how much their wives handle behind the scenes." After he left, I found myself thinking about our conversation more than I should have. Not because anything inappropriate had happened, but because talking to someone who seemed genuinely interested in my perspective had reminded me how long it had been since I'd felt truly heard. Alexander listened to me, but it was the kind of listening that came with an agenda to fix or discuss or analyze everything to death. Marcus had just heard what I was saying and responded like my feelings made perfect sense. When he came back a few weeks later for a follow-up service call, I made sure to be the one who answered the door. This time our conversation lasted even longer, moving beyond household maintenance to more personal topics. He asked about my work, my interests, the things I did for fun, and I realized how rarely anyone asked me about myself as an individual rather than as half of Alexander and Rachel. "You seem like someone who has a lot going on beneath the surface," Marcus said as he was getting ready to leave. "Your husband's a lucky guy if he's smart enough to pay attention to all of that." The implication in his words was clear, and instead of feeling offended or uncomfortable, I felt this thrill of being truly seen by someone who understood that I was more complex and interesting than my daily routine suggested. When he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime to continue our conversation, I said yes before I'd fully thought through what I was agreeing to. Coffee turned into longer conversations that left me feeling more alive and appreciated than I had in months. Marcus listened to me talk about my frustrations with married life without immediately jumping into problem-solving mode or defending Alexander's perspective. He seemed to understand that sometimes I just needed someone to acknowledge that my feelings were valid, even when they weren't particularly rational or fair. "Marriage is hard when you're with someone who doesn't really get who you are," he said during one of our meetings. "Some people are just too comfortable to see that their partner needs more than they're getting." I knew I was crossing lines that I shouldn't cross, but being with Marcus felt like coming back to life after months of sleepwalking through my routine with Alexander. When our coffee dates turned into something more physical, it felt less like a betrayal and more like finally giving myself something I'd been missing. Alexander had his comfortable routine and his certainty that everything between us was fine. Why shouldn't I have something that made me feel equally satisfied? The guilt I expected to feel never really materialized. Instead, I felt this clarity about what I'd been missing in my marriage and this appreciation for Marcus seeing and wanting parts of me that Alexander seemed to take completely for granted. When I was with Marcus, I remembered who I was outside of being someone's wife. Outside of managing household responsibilities and navigating Alexander's emotional needs, I became more careful about my phone, taking it with me to the bathroom and tilting the screen away when Alexander was nearby. But that felt like reasonable privacy rather than deception. Everyone deserved some space that was entirely their own. And the fact that Alexander seemed to expect complete transparency about everything felt controlling rather than loving. I'd never given him any real reason to distrust me, so his subtle monitoring of my behavior felt like punishment for Kay's actions, rather than anything I'd actually done. For months, I managed to balance both relationships without either man seeming to notice that anything had changed. Alexander continued his routine of work and weekend plans and earnest conversations about our future, while Marcus provided the excitement and appreciation that made everything else tolerable. It felt like I'd finally figured out how to get my needs met without having to sacrifice the stability and security that Alexander provided. Then I missed my period, and everything became infinitely more complicated. I knew immediately that the baby had to be Marcus's. Alexander and I had been careful about birth control, while Marcus and I had gotten caught up in the moment more than once without thinking about consequences. Sitting in my car outside the pharmacy with a positive pregnancy test in my hands, I felt this strange mixture of panic and possibility. A baby would change everything. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Alexander had talked about wanting children eventually, and he would be a devoted father, regardless of the biological details he didn't need to know. Marcus was exciting, but he wasn't the kind of man you built a stable life with. Even I could see that our relationship was more about escape and validation than long-term compatibility. The solution seemed obvious once I thought it through clearly. I would tell Alexander that we were pregnant and let him assume the timing worked out the way it appeared to. He would be thrilled to start a family. And I would have the security of his support along with the knowledge that this baby came from the most passionate and alive I'd felt in years. It wasn't really deception so much as managing information that would only hurt people unnecessarily. I told Marcus about the pregnancy first, needing to see his reaction before I decided how much of the truth to share. His face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like panic mixed with resignation. "Are you sure it's mine?" he asked, which wasn't exactly the response I'd been hoping for. "Pretty sure," I admitted. "Alexander and I haven't been as active lately." Marcus was quiet for a long time, and I could see him working through the implications. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell my husband we're pregnant," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "He doesn't need to know the details that would only hurt him." "And us?" Marcus asked. "What happens with us?" I hadn't fully thought that part through, but looking at his worried face, I realized that Marcus had never been a long-term solution anyway. He'd been exactly what I needed when I needed it. But a baby changed the priorities of everything. "I think we should probably cool things down," I said, "at least until I figure out how to handle all of this." He looked relieved, which told me everything I needed to know about how ready he was for real responsibility. Marcus was perfect for excitement and validation, but Alexander was the one who would actually show up for the hard parts of life. I was making the right choice for everyone involved. That evening, I told Alexander about the pregnancy, watching his face transform with joy and amazement that made me feel both guilty and validated. This was what he'd been waiting for. What would make him completely happy? And I was giving him that gift even if he didn't understand all the details. "Are you serious?" he asked, reaching for my hands with this expression of pure happiness. "We're really having a baby." "We're really having a baby," I confirmed. And his excitement was so genuine that I almost convinced myself the specifics didn't matter as much as the love this child would have from the man who would raise it. For several weeks, everything felt like it was working out exactly the way it should. Alexander threw himself into pregnancy research and planning with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else. And I found his attention and care more touching than annoying for the first time in months. He was going to be an amazing father, and our baby would be lucky to have him regardless of genetics. I kept texting with Marcus occasionally, mostly to update him on how things were going, and to maintain the connection that had meant so much to me. He seemed content to let me handle the situation however I thought was best, which confirmed that I'd made the right choice about where to focus my energy and commitment. But I got careless about my phone security, exhausted from pregnancy symptoms, and lulled into comfort by how well everything seemed to be working out. The night Alexander found my messages with Marcus, I fell asleep without my usual careful routine of clearing notifications and keeping my phone face down. I woke up to Alexander sitting on the edge of the bed holding my phone, his face completely different from any expression I'd ever seen him wear. Not angry exactly, but hollow in a way that made my stomach drop before I was even fully awake. "Who is this guy?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "Why are you telling him you're pregnant?" My mind raced through possible explanations and damage control strategies, but looking at Alexander's face, I could see that he'd read enough to understand the basic situation. Still, I had to try to salvage what I could. No, Alexander, you've got it all wrong," I said, sitting up and reaching for the phone. "I'm pregnant by you. Marcus is just a friend I confided in because I was scared about telling you." But even as I said it, I could see that he wasn't buying the explanation. He'd obviously read more than just one or two messages, and my heart sank as I realized how much detail Marcus and I had shared in our texts about the pregnancy timeline and our relationship. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, still holding my phone, and I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. When he turned back to face me, his expression was completely closed off. "We are getting a divorce," he said, and something about the finality in his voice made me feel this strange sense of relief along with the panic. I shrugged, surprising myself with the gesture, because part of me was almost glad that the pretending was over. Living between two different versions of myself had been exhausting, and at least now I could stop managing everyone else's feelings and expectations about who I was supposed to be. "If that's what you want," I said, and I meant it. Alexander deserved someone who could be satisfied with his version of love and commitment, and I deserved someone who understood that I needed more than routine and security to feel truly alive. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I'd expected, with Alexander handling everything through lawyers and refusing to engage in the kind of emotional processing I'd anticipated. He wanted a clean break with no ongoing contact, which felt harsh but also simplified things in a way that might be better for everyone. I moved in with Marcus, figuring that since everything was out in the open anyway, we might as well see if our connection could translate into something more substantial than secret meetings and text messages. For a few weeks, it felt like I'd made the right choice. Marcus was attentive and exciting, and I felt like myself in a way I hadn't experienced during the final months of my marriage. But without the contrast of my stable life with Alexander, Marcus's appeal began to fade quickly. The qualities that had made him an exciting escape, his unpredictability, his casual approach to responsibility, his tendency to prioritize his own needs, became exhausting when I was depending on him for actual support. When I was dealing with pregnancy symptoms and emotional upheaval from the divorce, Marcus seemed annoyed by my neediness, rather than understanding about what I was going through. "I thought you were stronger than this," he said when I broke down, crying after a particularly difficult day of nausea and legal paperwork. "You seemed so independent when we were together before." The criticism stung because it revealed how little he actually understood about what I'd been managing while maintaining relationships with both him and Alexander. I'd been independent because I had Alexander's stability as a foundation. Without that, I was discovering how much I'd been taking for granted about having a true partner who actually showed up during difficult times. When I lost the baby at 12 weeks, Marcus's response confirmed everything I'd started to realize about the difference between excitement and real love. He seemed almost relieved, making comments about how the timing wasn't right anyway, and how we could focus on just enjoying each other without complications. "Maybe this is for the best," he said when I came home from the hospital, and something inside me broke completely at the casual way he dismissed something that had meant everything to me. Within a week of the miscarriage, Marcus started finding excuses to be elsewhere when I needed support. He complained that I was too emotional, too demanding, too different from the fun person he'd fallen for. When he started staying out overnight without explanation and coming home with attitudes that made it clear he was already moving on, I realized that I'd given up everything stable and real for someone who had never seen me as more than a temporary diversion. The day Marcus packed his things and moved out, citing my neediness and his need for space to figure things out, I felt more alone than I'd ever been in my life. I was dealing with grief from losing the baby, regret about my marriage, and the growing realization that I'd made choices that couldn't be undone based on feelings that hadn't been nearly as meaningful as I'd convinced myself they were. My work situation became unstable as I struggled to focus and perform at my usual level, and I found myself isolated from most of the friends Alexander and I had shared as a couple. The hiking group that had brought us together felt impossible to return to, and I realized how much of my social life had been built around our relationship, rather than independent connections I'd maintained on my own. Months passed before I finally swallowed my pride and reached out to Alexander. I told myself I just needed to hear a familiar voice, someone who had actually cared about me, even if I'd been too confused to appreciate it properly at the time. When he answered the phone, the sound of his voice made me start crying before I could get through my planned explanation. "I lost the baby," I managed to say through tears, "and Marcus left. And I know I don't have any right to call you, but I don't have anyone else who would understand what I'm going through." There was a long pause before Alexander responded, and I could hear something in the background that sounded like other people talking and laughing. It occurred to me that he was probably with friends, living some version of the life he'd rebuilt after I'd destroyed our marriage. "I'm sorry you're going through that," he said finally, his voice careful and distant, "but I can't be that person for you anymore." "Rachel." The rejection hit me harder than I'd expected, especially since I could hear how completely he'd moved on, while I was still dealing with the consequences of choices I'd made months ago. "You're being heartless?" I said, anger mixing with desperation. "I thought you'd always be there for me, that you actually cared about me as a person." "I did care about you," Alexander replied, "but you made it clear that what I offered wasn't enough. You can't expect me to be your safety net now that everything else has fallen apart." After he hung up, I sat in my empty apartment thinking about how completely everything had changed from the life I'd had just a year earlier. Alexander had moved on, probably with people who appreciated what he brought to relationships instead of taking it for granted the way I had. He was hiking and working out and building the kind of meaningful connections I'd convinced myself he wasn't capable of. While I was alone dealing with consequences I'd never fully considered when I was focused on what I thought I deserved. The worst part was realizing that I'd had something real with Alexander, not perfect, but genuine and committed and built on actual love rather than just excitement and validation. I'd thrown that away for something that had felt more intense in the moment, but had never been designed to last beyond the thrill of being wanted by someone new. Now I was facing the reality that Alexander had been exactly who he'd appeared to be from the beginning. Someone who showed up, who kept his promises, who built rather than just consumed I'd been so focused on what felt missing that I'd missed what was actually there. And by the time I understood the difference, it was too late to do anything but live with the choices I'd made. The apartment felt impossibly quiet as I thought about Alexander probably sharing dinner with friends who valued his loyalty and consistency. While I sat alone with the knowledge that I'd been the one person who'd had access to all of that and had decided it wasn't enough. He'd kept every promise he'd made to me, except the one about always being there. And I couldn't even blame him for that, because I'd been the one who'd made it impossible for him to keep.